Joe Pullman here from craftworking.net, and in this video I'm going to explain my version of virtualization, or at least how it applies to my particular situation. So in virtualization, you've got something called a hypervisor, and this is the heart of virtualization in cloud computing. And what a hypervisor does is it's a piece of software that what it does is it abstracts or separates the hardware from the software. So in layman's terms, what this is doing is basically creating a file, and what it does is it connects to the operating system, the hypervisor, and the hypervisor makes the decisions on what hardware is to be allocated to that particular file, and that file is a virtual machine. So in virtualization terms, a file is a file just like any other file that you see, and it just defines what virtualization is. And in this file, what is contained is the operating system, and how it's formatted is how the hypervisor uses it to connect that particular operating system to the hardware that's underlying. In the past, basically you had a PC, you loaded an operating system on it, and that operating system, when it booted, grabbed every piece of hardware that it could find on that piece of hardware, that computer. So if you had 500 meg of hard drive space, it grabbed all of it. If it had 16 megabytes worth of, or gigabytes worth of RAM, it grabbed all of it. Every video monitor, keyboard, mice, whatever, the operating system allocated all of those resources to that particular operating system. Therefore, there's no way you can actually run two operating systems at the same time on the same computer. So what virtualization does is, because it takes away the software from the hardware and creates a file of the software, and you can have many files on a particular piece of hardware. And what you do is, when you create a virtual machine, you allocate a certain amount of hardware resources to that virtual machine. So if you want a virtual machine with 16 gig of RAM, you tell it this virtual machine has 16 gig of RAM, so much hard drive space, NIC cards, other hardware, USB, monitors, keyboards, and etc. Now, what it will do is then the hypervisor will allocate just that hardware to that machine. So now what this does is, now you can buy a big computer, a big server with lots of memory, lots of processors, lots of NIC cards, so on and so forth, and then the hypervisor will take a small part of that and allocate it to a particular virtual machine. So now you can have lots of virtual machines concurrently running on one piece of hardware, and the hypervisor will dole out the resources per virtual machine as much as it can take. Then what you can do with this is oversubscribe. So in a typical Windows environment, you may have, let's say, 8 gig of RAM, but it may only be using 1% of it or so. So when you go in there and you look at your resources, it means, oh yeah, my processor load is like 5% or whatever. So let's say 1% of 8 gig is 8 megabits worth of RAM. So not a lot. So what you can do is you can actually oversubscribe and create virtual machines that have more resources than the actual hardware can allow it to actually have. Then if for some reason that these virtual machines get overburdened and everything runs at 100%, then you start getting in ballooning and things will start falling apart on you. But you can actually run a lot more virtual machines and have a lot more resources than actually are allotted. But that's the big thing about virtualization, is that you can now run a whole bunch of computers on one piece of hardware, and they all run concurrently. So that's the beauty of it. So that brings me to the hypervisor itself. So now for you out there, the type of hypervisor that you get basically depends on your budget. When you get into small scale virtualization, I would recommend a Type 2 hypervisor, something like, you're probably familiar with Fusion, which is basically running a virtual hypervisor on a Mac. And what it allows you to do is create a virtual machine of, let's say, Linux or Windows, and run that inside of your Mac. And it runs as a completely separate instance. The hypervisor will allocate the resources on the Mac to that particular virtual machine, so whatever the virtual machine uses takes away from the Mac. So you have to kind of be careful with it, but Fusion, it can be had for less than $100, and it's very economical to use, and a lot of people do this, and that's actually virtualization. This is also called the Type 2 hypervisor. What it does is the hypervisor actually runs as a software on top of the Linux operating system, let's say, that the Mac runs. Or if you're using Zen, KVM or Zen or VirtualBox or something like that, same thing. You're going to run like a Linux distribution, and then the hypervisor will run on top of that. The downside of this is that now you don't get into the cloud computing aspect of it, where you now can use clustering and have many different pieces of hardware, and then move the virtual machines around to make your hardware more efficient. So in a Type 1 hypervisor, and I'm going to be using the example of VMware, that's what I'm most familiar with, is that it allows clustering. So you can have the hardware, which is called a host, and it may have a certain amount of hardware on it, resources, processors, memory, and then you buy another one exactly like it or very similar to it, and then what happens is that the virtual machine or VMware will decide by itself, without you intervening, what host or what server that actually runs on. And if you're running many virtual machines, it dynamically allocates the virtual machine to the particular hardware that has the most resources on it. So you get a balance of virtual machines to hardware. If a piece of hardware starts running over and getting high processor load or using excessive memory, VMware will actually decide to move it to another host which has more resources on it or more free resources on it. The problem is this gets very expensive very quickly. To run a VMware EXXI on a host, the licensing is extremely expensive. If you want to play with it, you can download the evaluation and use it for 90 days, I think it is, and it works, and you can experiment with it. Be prepared if you want to keep it. The licenses are ungodly expensive. Makes me wonder how the big boys really do this with virtualization, with tens of thousands of hosts, tens of thousands of processors. VMware licenses their VMware, their EXXI hypervisors by processor, physical processors. So when you're getting into this, the more cores the better. So keep that in mind. So in my environment, and what these videos are going to show you is I'm going to be using ESXi 6.0. I'm going to show you the upgrade from 5.5 to 6.0 and how I dealt with that. And but the big thing is that you need to be aware that if you want to do virtualization and cloud computing for real, VMware is going to be it is the most popular. There's other offerings out there. IBM's got virtualization, Oracle, you got Zen, you've got KVM for the Type 2, which most of you will probably get into, at least to start out with, is VirtualBox or VMware Player is by far my favorite to use as a Type 2. I've got a few instances of it running around here on some laptops that I've gotten. Works great, easy to use, very inexpensive. Like I said, if you want to get into this, you can definitely get a dedicated server, dedicated host, and spend less than $1,000 and get a really good setup. So in my setup, I'm going to be running two hosts. They're going to be enterprise servers from Supermicro. They're going to be the latest hardware as of 2016, which is running on E2600 processors, V3s, lots of RAM, and my personally, I spend quite a bit of money on this, but I actually do this for my job, so it's well worth it. So that's a basic introduction to my virtualization, and I'm going to take you through it. But keep in mind that what I'm doing is very expensive, but it allows me to do all the things that I'm going to be explaining in these videos, and kind of why I'm doing this. So in the next video, I'm going to start laying out the requirements of how I want my data center to actually work and what I'm doing to set that up. So hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you on the next video.